So as we start today with Earnest, I'm going to return to our metaphor that we have used through the year of discussing language mountain. We said from the very beginning of the year, and we mostly used it as a way to deal with poetry, that here at ground level of language mountain is literal meaning. A text says something and means exactly what it says. We understand a lot of that from last year's work with rhetoric. When you look at all the stuff you did for last year's AP test, we are looking at what is literally said and what is literally meant by the writer. As we look at literary text, though, we start to create that abstraction of language mountain. Slowly, we step into different bits that create situations where we say something, but we understand it differently. So if you think about one of the first steps that we took is to talk about connotation. Connotation is the implied meaning of a word. In order for an implied or associated meaning to work, an audience has to have a shared understanding that, yes, this is what it literally means, but this is what we understand it to mean. And so we're starting to step away from literals. A further abstraction would be to look at something like a metaphor. An author has to give you at least enough to understand that I could say green light in a work like The Great Gatsby, and I've given you enough to understand what you should associate with that green light and how it's meaningful. But its meaning isn't a literal green light. There's more to it. As we look at where we're talking today, I want you to think about the clouds that are around really high mountains. Because as we introduce these concepts like irony and humor and satire, quite literally with all of these, we are going to say one thing, but convey the exact opposite, or something that is antithetical to that. When we talk about comedy as a whole, students sometimes get really frustrated because they assume that when we study comedy, all we're going to do is to explain why a joke is funny. No. I want you to just think for a second, based on your understanding, how would you define comedy? I know that's really kind of abstract, but it's okay. How would you define it? Even if we go back to the beginning of the year, you might remember, maybe we can help to start that definition by talking about what comedy isn't. When we started the year and we talked about tragedy, we said that, often in theater classes and on theater emblems, you have those two masks that they love to roll out. And, one of them is the sad face and the other's the happy face. So in talking about comedy, you could understand that it's not tragedy. Okay, great. We know plenty about tragedy. How do tragedies end? Death. Well, that's not how comedies end. Comedies tend to end in marriage, though some would say that's a sort of death. Instead, here, comedies are that opposite, where a tragedy deals with a character who grapples with major issues and feels as though they are wronged. Comedy instead is lightsome. It pokes fun. And often when we poke fun, we are looking to point out an issue or advocate for change. And so with humor, we're looking for things that often maybe don't make sense, things that don't seem to work, things that are there. And so as we look at constructing comedy, most people will tell you there are two types of comedy. What we would call a low comedy and a high comedy. Low comedies are really simple things that made you laugh as a kid. Fart jokes, any kind of physical humor, characters falling, characters getting hit, characters blowing up. Low humor seems to be negative, but instead think about it as simple. High comedy is often functioning in a way to point out something about society or culture, how we are. It's engaging an idea rather than just giving you something to chuckle at. And this is the register that we are going to deal with as we look at comedy in fiction. And we want to do this here before we hit the AP test because it's very hard to recognize sometimes when something is working in a comedic way. Think about the times that a teacher has put a play in front of you or an essay or some kind of piece of writing, and you've read it, and then the teacher goes, "It's funny. This is comedy." And you're having to be like, "This isn't funny. I didn't laugh once at this. How is this funny?" We want to look at how it's constructed. What choices does an author make? They might not make us laugh out loud, but how are they saying the opposite and often pointing at a subject to either ridicule or advocate for change? There's some easy things that we can always look for. One is the use of irony and the use of incongruities. So irony at its simplest form is when the expected does not happen. When we talk about something being incongruous, if I gave you a rich man who all of a sudden couldn't put his hands on any money to pay for something, those two things don't seem to work together. Those incongruities, those things that don't seem to work, they often create humor because they're opposites. We deal in two different styles of wordplay. Hyperbole, which is a gross over-exaggeration, as well as understatement, where we say less than what we mean. Great example of a hyperbole is a yo mama joke. A great example of an understatement would be to imagine a guy sitting down to a giant dinner and saying, "Wow, this looks like a great snack." Lastly, the two areas that we often see more vocally would be sarcasm as well as puns. And so as we look, our goal in studying comedy and looking at this play is not to deconstruct the jokes and suddenly make it not funny, but instead to talk about what are the choices we're going to notice this writer make to help bring the meaning forward. So we're always going to be pointed at what's the target, what's he trying to do, what's he making fun of. Oscar Wilde is an Irish writer. If you notice, we don't have dates on here on this. On your page on Canvas, we have dates on him. So you notice, late 19th century writer. He is known as a drinker. He is known as a playboy. He is known for his wit. He worked in a lot of different modes. So he wrote many plays. He was also a poet. He was also a novelist. He tended to focus on the idea of art being created for the aesthetic of art, for the beauty of art, not having it necessarily have to mean something or be something, simply for enjoyment. And you'll see that a lot of his work kind of functions in that way. If we take a look at the very start here, you're going to notice that we have a list of characters. This is a smaller play. It is a lot more contained in terms of characters. And we're going to start today with 3. John Worthing, Algernon Moncrief, and Lane, and who is it in the first act? Lane, who is his butler. If you flip and you look at how we have the scenes laid out, specifically the acts, each act is going to take place in a very specific place. And so we're going to open Act 1 in Algernon Moncrief's flat in Half Moon Street, so in London. We're then going to move to the country, and we'll talk a little more about that, but we're going to focus this week on Act 1. So if you take a look at the very beginning of the play, this is page 7. We're going to use an audio version here as we work. But we're going to notice here that we have some setting with scene. We know that we're in Algernon's apartment. So they tell you that we're in the morning room in Algernon's flat in Half Moon Street. Anybody know what a morning room is? Take a wild guess. What do you imagine a morning room is? Why would you spend time in that room in the morning? Remember, we're in the 19th century, so we don't have electric lights. We don't have some of those conveniences. What direction likely do the windows in that room face? East. That way you get the sunlight. So think, this is somebody's apartment that's able to have a specific morning room. Like, that's pretty fancy. The room is luxuriously and artistically furnished. And so imagine, it's over the top. It's very fancy. The sound of a piano is heard in the adjoining room. Okay, so give yourself a second to process that. What do you hear? What kind of music does it sound like? Again, we know that this is a fancy apartment. Lane, who is the butler, is arranging tea on the table. And after the music has ceased, Algernon is going to enter. And so he's going to enter as though from the next room, but the music stops first. So we're going to pick up here. It's going to present us the text. Follow along. As we read, think about a couple of things. First, like always, what do you notice? You might not be able to put your finger on some of these things yet, and that's okay. Think about what makes you laugh. What catches your attention? Because a lot of times we can work from that. Then we're going to work back to go, hey, what's the author doing? And then what's the purpose? What ultimately are we trying to point at with our humor? So let's get the audio up.
Act 1 of The Importance of Being Earnest by Oscar Wilde. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Importance of Being Earnest, a trivial comedy for serious people, by Oscar Wilde. The persons in the play: John Worthing, J.P.
Read by Dublin Gothic.
Algernon Moncrief.
Read by John Fricker.
Miss Prism, Governess. Read by Carol. Algernon enters.
Did you hear what I was playing, Lane?
I didn't think it polite to listen, sir.
I'm sorry for that, for your sake. I don't play accurately. Anyone can play accurately, but I play with wonderful expression. As far as the piano is concerned, sentiment is my forte. I keep science for life.
Yes, sir.
And speaking of the science of life, have you got the cucumber sandwiches cut for Lady Bracknell?
Yes, sir.
Hands them on a salver. Inspects them, takes two, and sits down on a sofa.
Oh, by the way, Lane, I see from your book that on Thursday night, when Lord Shorman and Mr. Worthing were dining with me, 8 bottles of champagne are entered as having been consumed.
Yes, sir. 8 bottles and a pint.
Why is it that at a bachelor's establishment the servants invariably drink the champagne? I ask merely for information.
I attribute it to the superior quality of the wine, sir. I have often observed that in married households, the champagne is rarely of a first-rate brand.
Good heavens! Is marriage so demoralizing as that?
I believe it is a very pleasant state, sir. I've had very little experience of it myself up to the present. I've only been married once. That was in consequence of a misunderstanding between myself and a young person.
I don't know that I am much interested in your family life, Lane.
No, sir. It is not a very interesting subject. I'd never think of it myself.
Very natural, I am sure. That'll do, Lane, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So let's take a second to process just this first page. What are some of the things that you noticed? Who is? Yeah. So we have Algernon here. Snobbish. Yeah, that's right. What comes off to you as snobbish about him?
He says he's not that interested
Yeah. Notice how he dismisses Lane. Again, go back to who is Lane? His servant. Do you necessarily, think about situations. Now, again, they are not your servants, but I still want you to just think about situations where you are in public trying to get something done, or someone, is doing a service for you and they're talking about every detail of their life. Do you need it? Think about the times you go to check out at a store and the person that's there just starts talking and you're just like, can I just pay and go? Like, notice there, we have that bit of like, I'm better than you. I have this. This is a comedy of manners. So within the work, you're going to notice that that society, manners, pieces like that are going to be the topics we're going to address and kind of kick at. And so here, we introduce this idea of family life. Hey, tell me a little bit about how we talk about family life and marriage here in this first page even. Huh? Negatively, okay. How? Yes. How do we show that demoralizing quality of marriage? They talk about the quality of the booze. Algernon poses a question. He says, hey, on the register, on the records that you keep, it says that there were 8 bottles of champagne that we went through the other night. And he's like, why did the servants drink so much champagne in a single guy's house? Lane says it's because of the quality. Single guys spend more on good booze. And he goes, God, is marriage that demoralizing that the guys don't want to spend the money on the good stuff anymore? Notice that we have marriage as this kicking post. It is going to be through this whole play. Get ready for it, get used to it. Because when we look, we create comedy often through shared situations. And so if something is a very specific and minute joke, it's not going to make everybody laugh. But if it's a topic that hits everybody, and a lot of people at the time are married, it's going to work. And so marriage is going to be the kicking post because it's a big part of proper society and manners. And so here we begin this idea of Algernon as this snobbish playboy. He is single. He spends money. He has that. Notice how Lane discusses marriage on the opposite end. He says, I have very little experience of it myself. I've only been married once. What does that tell you about the expectations of society around people? Do they get married once and stay with that person for a long time? Or do they tend to get married multiple times? We kind of have that idea based on how Lane is saying it, like, I don't have a whole lot of experience with it. I've only been married once. We know that there's that expectation, but they're playing it up that those with experience would be people that would have done it more times. And notice how he follows it up. That was in consequence of a misunderstanding between myself and a young person. Do 2 people get married because of a misunderstanding? But as people are married, could you say that the things that they learn about the other person that make them kind of split apart are because of how they were presented at first? Notice how we create this sense here by using some of these words, the incongruities. We have certain expectations about marriage, about how many times people get married, about how that process goes through. So when we have words like, it was a misunderstanding, I was only married once, we're seeing how he's attacking these bits of society through these small little choices in how he constructs it. And the construction is the important part. It's not explaining the joke, but it's seeing, How are we attacking society's expectations of things? Let's go back to the piano playing. Why didn't Lane listen to him play the piano? Because what? Yeah, and he also says, I didn't think it was polite to listen. Algernon follows that up by saying, I don't play accurately, I play with wonderful expression. Think about what you heard in your head. When I told you that the rich guy was playing piano, you probably thought of something classical. You probably thought of something melodious. And instead, what do we get? Something that's not played accurately. So could he have been banging on the keys? Could he have been playing like all wrong? Irony. We expect that a rich, proper man of society who is going to choose to play the piano is going to play it well and correctly, and instead we get this. Nope. You notice that we're playing against type. We're presenting this very different kind of figure. Now, he has introduced an idea about cucumber sandwiches. Do you know what a cucumber sandwich is? This is like a little tea snack. And so I want you to imagine a small sandwich, roughly the length of your finger. On it is like cream cheese and thinly sliced cucumbers put together. Sometimes they would use butter instead. It's meant to be a small snack to go alongside tea. Algernon is asking about them because his aunt, she's introduced as Lady Bracknell, is going to come for tea. Lady is a term we use for proper society. So in English society, someone who is a lady is the female version of a lord. So she is a member of the upper class. If we know that this is a comedy of manners and our target is society, oh, we're going to have fun with her. We're not going to get there yet. Now, Lane is going to go out. Algernon is going to continue. And then we are going to introduce Ernest Worthing. But you notice that it says enter Jack. Do not get confused. They are the same person. We're going somewhere with the joke.
Lane goes out.
Lane's views on marriage seem somewhat lax. Really, if the lower orders don't set us a good example, what on earth is the use of them? They seem as a class to have absolutely no sense of moral responsibility.
Enter Lane.
Mr. Ernest Worthing.
Enter Jack. Lane goes out.
How are you, my dear Ernest? What brings you up to town?
Oh, pleasure, pleasure. What else should bring one anywhere? Eating as usual, I see, Algy.
I believe it is customary in good society to take some slight refreshment at 5 o'clock. Where have you been since last Thursday?
Sitting down on the sofa.
In the country.
What on earth do you do there?
Pulling off his gloves.
When one is in town, one amuses oneself. When one is in the country, one amuses other people. It is excessively boring.
And who are the people you amuse?
Oh, neighbours, neighbours.
Got nice neighbours in your part of Shropshire.
Perfectly horrid. Never speak to one of them.
How immensely you must amuse them.
Goes over and takes sandwich.
By the way, Shropshire is your county, is it not?
Huh? Shropshire? Yes, of course. Hello. Why all these cups? Why cucumber sandwiches? Why such reckless extravagance in one so young? Who is coming to tea?
Oh, merely Aunt Augusta and Gwendolen.
How perfectly delightful.
Yes, that is all very well, but I am afraid Aunt Augusta won't approve of your being here.
May I ask why?
My dear fellow, the way you flirt with Gwendolen is perfectly disgraceful. It is almost as bad as the way Gwendolen flirts with you.
I am in love with Gwendolen. I have come up to town expressly to propose to her.
I thought you had come up for pleasure. I call that business.
How utterly unromantic you are.
I really don't see anything romantic in proposing. It is very romantic to be in love, but there is nothing romantic about a definite proposal. Why? One may be accepted, one usually is, I believe, then the excitement is all over. The very essence of romance is uncertainty. If ever I get married, I'll certainly try to forget the fact.
Okay, before we flip the page, let's talk about what we have here, how we're creating this humor, what we have. Let's start with the cucumber sandwiches. Who are they supposed to be for? His aunt. What's he doing with them? He's eating them. So we know how comedy works. You have to trust as well. You are a person of the world. You watch things. We consume plot at such an amazing rate anymore in our lives. You know where this is going. If the cucumber sandwiches are for his aunt and he's eating them, what's going to happen when the aunt gets there? Huh? They're going to be finished. You know that's going to happen. So watch for it, wait for it, anticipate it. Because again, you know how this works. I guarantee you do. We start to talk about how these two are. What are some of the things that stood out to you? Let's talk about some targets. Where is Jack coming from? The country. Now, this is a comedy of manners. And Algernon lives in the city. And so we contrast the difference between country and city to some degree. He says when one is in town, one amuses oneself. When one's in the country, one amuses other people. He says it's boring. What does Jack have to say about his neighbors, though? Huh? He doesn't like them, but he also says he never speaks to any of them. So is he particularly successful at doing what he's supposed to do? So notice how we start to characterize Jack. He is similar to Algernon. They are both bachelors. And they both are focused on the indulgence of self, pleasures. And so they start to talk about his part of the country. And Jack comes to that understanding of like, oh, look at it. You got cups out. You got cucumbers. Ooh, who's coming to tea? What's on this for? And we introduce Aunt Augusta. So the Lady Bracknell is Aunt Augusta. In British proper society, you have your own Christian name, but when you come into a lord or a ladyship, those are established places that are often based on pre-existing houses or parts of the country. And so this is her title, and this is her name. So it's kind of like if you know anything about the British royalty, especially with Prince Philip having just died. He has a title, but he also has a name, and he even further has a real name he was born with. And so if you start to dig, you notice those differences. So as we talk about these characters, don't get too confused, but we know Aunt Augusta is going to come as well as whom? Gwendolyn. And who's interested in Gwendolyn? Jack. Is it uncommon for two people to flirt if they are single and interested in each other? But look at how it's presented here as these two guys talk to each other. He says this is from Algernon. He says it's perfectly disgraceful how you flirt with Gwendolyn. And it's almost as bad as the way Gwendolyn flirts with you. Would we normally say that flirtation between two young people is a good thing? Yes. Here we present it as a bad thing. It's an incongruity. We expect one thing, but they're saying something different. They then talk about the difference between pleasure and business because Jack says, I've come to propose. Algernon plays the heel. You liar, you told me you were here for business. Or you said you were here for pleasure. Proposing to someone sounds like business. We hit once again on marriage and we kick it. And then we start to talk about the romanticism of proposing. Based on the logic, how does he explain it? Why does Algernon say proposing is not romantic?
Because it's not, it doesn't represent love itself.
Why?
Because he says it's romantic to be in love. There's nothing romantic about a definite proposal.
And look at that definite proposal. So I proposed, but guess what? I made sure I was going to get a yes before I asked the question and spent any kind of money. I made sure, hey, is this where we're going? So even though the day I chose to do it might have been a surprise, I knew what she was going to say. I knew how things were going to work out. As opposed to, I do have a friend who was proposed to at a basketball game with no warning ahead of time, and she said no. Yeah, one of those kinds of awkward situations where it was just like, oh, this is uncomfortable and awesome at the same time. Notice here that we present that idea. Is Algernon's argument logical? That there's nothing romantic about a definite proposal because you already know what's going to happen. But it plays into often logical things like that help us to create that comedy and that humor of pointing out how we are. We present certain things one way, but logic is clearly there to be like, no, this doesn't work. And of course, he follows it up by saying the very essence of romance is uncertainty. He says, if I ever get married, I'll certainly try to forget the fact. Notice that we have a pun, uncertainty versus I'll certainly forget the fact. But we also have that kind of idea. We know that Algernon is unlikely to get married right away. And so for him to bring it up, it's like, yeah, this won't be a problem. We got time. Okay, we're going to go a little bit further here as they talk about bachelors and society and those kinds of things.
I have no doubt about that, Archie. The divorce court was specially invented for people whose memories are so curiously constituted.
Oh, there is no use speculating on that subject. Divorces are made in heaven.
Jack puts out his hand to take a sandwich. Algernon at once interferes.
Please don't touch the cucumber sandwiches. They are ordered especially for Aunt Augusta.
Takes one and eats it.
Well, you have been eating them all the time.
That is quite a different matter. She is my aunt.
Takes plate from below.
Have some bread and butter. The bread and butter is for Gwendolen. Gwendolen is devoted to bread and butter.
Advancing to table and helping himself.
And very good bread and butter it is, too.
Well, my dear fellow, you need not eat it as if you were going to eat it all. You behave as if you were married to her already. You are not married to her already, and I don't think you ever will be.
Why on earth do you say that?
Well, in the first place, girls never marry the men they flirt with. Girls don't think it right.
Oh, that is nonsense.
It isn't. It is a great truth. It accounts for the extraordinary number of bachelors that one sees all over the place. In the second place, I don't give my consent.
Your consent?
My dear fellow, Gwendolen is my first cousin, and before I allow you to marry her, you will have to clear up the whole question of Cecily.
Rings bell.
Cecily? What on earth do you mean? What do you mean, Algie, by Cecily? I don't know anyone of the name of Cecily.
All right, so if we take a look here at how they discuss this idea further, what do you notice?
He's like eating the sandwiches. It's like you can't eat them.
You're 100% correct. Notice that what we have here, we have different types of irony, and we can start to introduce this here. Irony can display in different forms. So one form of irony that we know from Oedipus is dramatic irony. Dramatic irony occurs when an audience understands or knows a truth that a character on stage doesn't know. So as we watch Oedipus, the entire audience knows that Oedipus is the killer of Laos, that Oedipus has slept with his mother and fathered children with her. We know that. And so as we hear Oedipus talk about, I'm going to find the killer, we kind of laugh and go, yeah, all right. We know that. Dramatic irony works that way. Situational irony is where we put the situation itself becomes ironic in some way. This is closer to what we have here. Notice that Algernon's excuse for why he can eat the cucumber sandwiches is, well, they're from my aunt. That's no, that doesn't work. That's not logical. That's not there at all. But we present it that way. The last version is verbal irony. This is usually when they say something and it's the opposite of what they mean or intend. Being able to qualify these doesn't matter as much, but it can sometimes help you to recognize what they're doing. And so here, for sure, we have the presentation of what can be eaten by whom as the reasoning. And of course, Algernon just kind of shows him off on, well, eat the bread and butter. That's for Gwendolyn anyway. And then chides him. Man, slow your roll a little bit. Like, you're already acting like you're married to her because you think you can just take whatever is hers. Well, do people in marriage tend to feel that way? For sure. They talk about flirting. Notice that we come back to it. And Algernon has this argument about girls never marry the men they flirt with. Girls don't think it right. Well, do you often see married couples flirting with each other out in public? I know that sounds really odd, where you're like, people tend to fall once they find that comfortable relationship. Some of those little things of romance start to go away. They might not flirt. They might not touch as much. They might not do those things because there's just a comfort to them. And so he points that out. Usually when we see flirting, it's between younger people or people that aren't married to each other. So we spin it in this way to make it work. Then we're going to introduce this idea of, hey, you can't marry my cousin because first you're going to have to explain to me who Cecily is. We're going to get really convoluted tomorrow in introducing Cecily, clearing up why he keeps calling Jack Earnest, and also some further pieces about what's going on in this play. So we're going to put a pin in it for today.